the journalists, members of Congress, and other policymakers in Washington who should be guests on the call-in shows. And it's just a way to try to make sure that the people that our viewers want to talk to are on the air in a timely fashion so that they can question them or hear their views from them and foster just an exchange of ideas.
The C-SPAN call-in program, 3 hours live every weekday at 8 o'clock a.m. and 6:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Senator Howell Heflin of Alabama is a member of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Sitting on that committee, he's been involved firsthand with the confirmation and impeachment of federal judges. Join C-SPAN as Senator Heflin discusses the impeachment process and the trial of Nevada Judge Harry Claiborne. He will speak before the American Bar Association's mid-year meeting, Sunday, February 7th at 5:30 p.m. Eastern, 2:30 p.m. Pacific Time on C-SPAN.
Up next, former Arizona Governor Bruce Babbitt is our guest on a live viewer call-in program. We invite your questions and comments about the Babbitt campaign.
Bruce Babbitt, Democratic candidate for president, former governor of Arizona. It's 3 days to caucus night. What will your campaign be doing in the next 3 days?
Carl, stopping everywhere in Iowa we possibly can to kind of give the closing argument to the jury, to sum up a year and a half, contrast myself to my opponents, and urge people to turn out.
With as much information as there is being spread through the news media, the candidates out, can you actually change somebody's mind at this late date in the game?
Yeah, you really can. It's tremendously fluid. It's just absolutely amazing. I gave a speech about the Middle East at Coe College this afternoon, and I'd say half the audience was uncommitted. And you can sort of stand as people, you know, comment after the speech, and you sense that you really can change. Very fluid.
You said you've been campaigning in the state for at least a year and a half. Are you finding now that you're going around and shaking someone's hand for the second, maybe even third time?
Listen, I've met people who come up and say, look, I've heard you speak 6 or 7 or 8 times, and I still haven't made up my mind.
Is there a new message we'll see from the Babbitt campaign in the last 3 days?
Look, any campaign that's trying out a new message in the last 3 days is in big trouble. It seems to me it's time to talk thematically, to reinforce your television ads, to sum it up to the jury. Say, you know, here's what it's all about. In my case, confronting reality and contrasting yourself with the other candidates and underlining the themes I've been making in the last week. That, look, these are good guys, but they've basically been avoiding the issues. They haven't leveled with you about the economic choices. I have, and that's why my campaign really is a little different.
Challenging the other campaigns one by one. You started last week. Your press people made it very clear one day you were going to attack one candidate and the next day you were going to attack another. Do you think that people turn off to that after a while if you begin attacking everybody in the
come
field?
on, it's not really attacking. I mean, attack, you know, sounds like you're, you know, going after them personally. This is contrasting records, saying, here's what Paul Simon stands for, here's what's wrong with it, and here's what I stand for. Now, that's not really attacking. It seems to me that's fair comment, a nice summary, designed to say, hey, there really are differences. And, you know, there's such a thing as being too polite. The point that you're too polite, you know, how do you expect people to draw distinctions?
With that, let's open up the phone lines. We are live from the 3rd floor of the Hotel Fort Des Moines, downtown Des Moines, Iowa, capital of this state. We've been here since Monday, broadcasting live from here. We'll be here through caucus night, where we will be broadcasting live a Democratic and Republican caucus in their entirety, as well as tape-delayed coverage of 2 rural caucuses, one in Madison County and one in Jones County, over by the eastern part of the state. But for the next 45 minutes, we have with us one of the Democratic candidates for president. His name is Bruce Babbitt. He is the former governor of Arizona, was from 78 to 1987. Before that, he was the Arizona Attorney General, 75 to 78. Has a lot of grief degree from Harvard University. He's married with 2 children. He's originally from Los Angeles, announced his candidacy for President of the United States March 10. Part of campaigning includes long days, many stops, plane travels. What was your schedule like today? What did you do today in this campaign?
Carl, I started out on the CBS Morning News at 6 o'clock Des Moines time. Got on an airplane, made appearances in Mount Pleasant to high school assembly, and Ottumwa at lunch, Coe College this afternoon, a couple of appearances here in Des Moines in the afternoon. It's barnstorming in the real sense of the word. The idea is to get into as many media markets as you can, to summarize your themes again and again and again.
Let's take a look at the New York Times for today, and I want to ask you about the glamour of running for president as we take a shot. Photograph. It's an AP photograph, and you're wiping the snow off of a windshield. Is it glamorous to run for president?
Listen, that was one of the most frustrating days I've ever spent. We'd made a commitment to go to New Hampshire. We left, spent overnight, and all of a sudden we're knocked in a snowstorm. Can't get out of the airport. Got nothing to do except throw snowballs at each other and think of the time, you know, fading away, waiting to get out. And we finally got back here last night.
Phone lines are open for viewers in all areas of the country. One line is devoted to the viewers here in Iowa, the other line for the rest of you around the country. You can begin dialing as those numbers appear. First call is from Modesto, California. Good evening to you. Go ahead, please.
Good evening. I feel that it's wrong for the lady who answers the phones to insist that callers talk about a certain subject when a politician or reporter is the guest. However, if she is allowed to insist, then C-SPAN should provide one day a week when callers may talk about whatever they wish for a change.
All right, what do you want to talk about? What's your question?
Also, Governor, President Reagan has said that raising taxes would be deleterious to our economy. Well, you know, he should have thought about that before he went on his huge spending spree, you know, building up our defense and adding billions to our interest payments. And now, Governor, he wants the poor and needy to pay for his spending spree. But I feel that the only fair way to deal with our huge budget deficit is to either cut what has mainly caused our deficit, and that is to cut military spending or to add taxes. And since it was mainly the upper income groups who were responsible for, you know, for the election of President Reagan, I feel that it's about time that they, not the poor and needy, you know, started paying for what has mainly been his mistakes, and do so by adding higher tax bracket. And I believe that whenever taxes are raised, that if at the same time the discount rate is lowered and the money supply increased, that this would counteract any negative effects that taxes would have on the economy.
Modesto, I'm going to hold you there. Governor Babbitt.
Well, you know, I hardly know where to start. Yeah, we got to cut spending. Military spending, certainly. I think we have to cut domestic spending, and, you know, the way to do that is to cut some of the benefits that go to the very wealthy, to people who don't need them, whether they're, you know, farmers or upper income entitlement recipients. And, you know, I think it's self-evident that if we're going to be honest with each other, we have to raise taxes. Now, I agree that taxes ought to be progressive. I like a consumption tax because I think you'll agree with me that, you know, it's a stimulus to savings and investment. And I think you can make it progressive. You simply lower the bottom bracket of the income tax. You refund the equivalent of the tax to people who have no income. And then you've got a good tax. Nobody can avoid it. It can't be evaded. You know, you can use it to reach the drug dealer when he buys his Mercedes and his Citation jet, the guy who'd never pay any income taxes. So I guess, you know, I'd go most of the way with you.
Harlan, Iowa, you're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Good evening, Governor.
Good evening.
I saw your wife this afternoon. She's a very charming woman, and I must say a very capable advocate in your cause.
Thank you very much. I agree.
The arguments around your household must be hell.
Yeah, you ought to see it when my kids are in it.
Governor, I'm calling specifically to invite you to address an issue that I heard you discuss one time on an interview show with Marvin Kalb. In the last few weeks, it seems like your attacks have been a little bit more strident in trying to separate yourself from the other candidates as being a candidate with having guts. You mentioned one incident to me that illustrated guts to me, and I'd like for you to talk to us a little bit, if you could, about the incident with the copper strikes in your state and the way you dealt with it and the final outcome of that incident.
Okay, briefly, what he's referring to is my use of the National Guard in the copper camps in Arizona back in, let's say, I guess it was 1983. Essentially, the story that I tell relates to a copper strike which gets out of hand. The violence begins. One night in August of 1983, a 3-year-old girl named Chandra Talan awakes in the middle of the night screaming, and a bullet has gone right through her forehead. Just random violence. She's asleep in her house, shot through the head in random gunfire. We air-evac her out to Phoenix, and miraculously she recovers. One day on my way home from work, I went by the hospital to visit her. The mother was there. The kids virtually recovered, playing on her bed. The mother puts the kid in my arms and says, what are you going to do to prevent somebody else's kid from getting shot? That's kind of the essence of what happened. Well, about a month later, the violence breaks out again, and remembering that incident, I ultimately moved with the National Guard. Just simply said, we got to protect lives. That's what this is all about, whether it's strikers, non-strikers, but most importantly, innocent people. So, you know, that's kind of what happened. Now, 3 years later, it happened again, and organized labor asked me in to mediate the strike, and we settled it. So, you know, you win some, you lose some.
Now you're running for president. Does it hurt you with union workers?
Well, I think there are a lot of questions. When people hear the explanation, the one that I gave on the Marvin Kalb show, in which I just summarized, people say, yeah, look, there are times when the public safety requires that you do that kind of thing, that you have the guts to make sure that nobody else is killed. It came full circle in 1986 because we had another one of these disputes headed toward a real problem, and it was organized labor that asked me to come in and mediate the strike. So I think that suggests that they understood that in 1983 we ran out of alternatives, had to do it, had to keep the peace. But they were back for my assistance in '86, and it worked.
Baltimore, Maryland, go ahead, please.
Hello, Governor Babbitt.
Good afternoon.
Hi, I'm not old enough to vote yet, but I'm a very fervent supporter of yours.
Thank you.
First of all, I'd like to say I'm very sorry about your father. And I was wondering, do you feel that you have the organization to really turn out and make a very good showing in Iowa?
Well, you know, that's the $64 question right now. We've got a tremendous organization. Now, we started a long ways behind in Iowa because, you know, Gephardt living in Missouri, relatively well-known. Simon living in Illinois, relatively well-known. Dukakis, you know, a mountain of money. So we started out fairly far behind. But we had a tremendous month. And I really think that my message is now beginning to catch on, that people are understanding, you know, that the future doesn't just happen, and that the dreams that all of us talk about as Democrats, and rightfully so, about social justice, about providing for children, for the elderly, are just daydreams. They're pipe dreams, unless we start talking honestly about that budget deficit, about how it is you make principled cuts, how it is you raise revenues, about changes in the American workplace. That's kind of a long answer, but I think that message is going to pay off. The organization's out there. The results will be in on Monday, and I anticipate being in Maryland on Super Tuesday. So I appreciate your help.
Iowa City, Iowa, good evening to you. Go ahead, please.
Hello.
You're on the air, ma'am. Go ahead, please.
Yes. I would like to ask more about the national sales tax. The specifics of it worry a lot of us that are on the low-income end of the scale. Would you exempt food, medicine, and shelter from that?
Absolutely, positively.
Okay, that's the answer that I wanted to know. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thanks for the call. We appreciate it. We're live from the 3rd floor of the Hotel Fort Des Moines, and we will be here all week. We will be broadcasting live a Democratic and Republican caucus here in the Des Moines area. The Republican caucus will be broadcast live from Cedar Rapids, and over the course of the next several days we'll have a wide variety of stump speeches from the candidates, as well as interviews with some of the journalists covering this campaign and campaign staffers as well. Right now we have one of the Democratic candidates joining us. If you'd like to join our conversation, just use the numbers at the bottom of your screen. Palisade, New York, you're on the air with Governor Babbitt. Go ahead, please.
Governor, I agree that a sales tax is not regressive if offset by income tax credits, and is the best way to eliminate the annual and accumulated deficit. However, your message is not getting through.
You must get the details of this plan out, understood and accepted before it is too late. Even if you do not win the nomination, it's too important for this nation's future, in my opinion.
Thank you. Listen, I really appreciate what you're saying. You know, sometimes it's kind of tough when you say things that other people aren't saying. And that's essentially the point I'm trying to make, is that if we care about the future, as you suggest, we got to have the courage to talk about these things. And the reason some of these concepts, I think, sound so different is because nobody else is talking about them. I appreciate your advice. I'll do my darndest.
In looking at the state of Iowa, one of the things we were just discussing with E.J. Dion from the New York Times was the whole process of running for president, whether or not this is really a very good way of electing the leader of this country, meaning you have to come out to a state like Iowa and almost act as if you're running for a county commissioner, shake all the hands, attend all the banquets. You've been through this for a year and a half. Is this a good way of electing a president?
Carl, I'll tell you, there are times when I wake up in the morning saying there has to be a better way. But what is it? I mean, I can think of one better way, a caucus system which starts in Arizona. But no, seriously, there's a strong case for the retail part of this. I mean, there can only be 1 or 2 states where you meet people again and again and again and kind of get a chance to see a candidate when they're, bright-eyed and really up, and when they're dragging after an 18-hour day, and you really get to see them up close. Yeah, I can't think of a better way.
Clearly loaded question, but do you find that the voters of Iowa take this seriously?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's unbelievable. I mean, there are people that I'm calling this week that I've met 3, 4, 5, 6 times, who tell me they've narrowed their list down. They've crossed off 5 candidates. I've talked to them, again and again over 6 months, and they say, well, we're now down to Bruce Babbitt and Jesse Jackson, or Bruce Babbitt and somebody else, and you're still wooing them, on the eve of the caucus.
Davenport, Iowa, go ahead, please.
Yes, Governor Babbitt.
How you doing?
Hi, fine. First of all, I'd like to commend you on being the only candidate with enough guts to show up at the Poor People's Campaign in Davenport, Iowa.
Oh, that was a fun evening. It really was.
Yeah, and then what I would like to ask about is concerning your conventional deployment in Europe.
Right.
I'm wondering where you're planning on getting the funds to pay for this.
Well, it's not a matter of spending a lot more money. I think it's a matter of reconfiguring that defense. If we move away from the use of a lot of these tactical nuclear weapons, I think there are some savings. If you move from, dual capable artillery, for example, to conventional artillery, those kinds of things, I think you can construct defenses that are a lot more effective than the ones we have. Got to integrate the British and the French together into NATO. Those things don't cost money, but they take a lot of political will, and I think the American president has to provide it.
Rochester, New York, go ahead, please.
Hello, Governor Babbitt. I have a question concerning your ideas on federal support for the arts. This is something I haven't heard any of the candidates mention, and since you're the first one I get a chance to talk to, you get the question first. Okay.
Look, there ought to be federal support for the arts. During my time as governor of Arizona, I doubled and redoubled the arts budget. Even as somebody who's worried about budget deficits, the line item for arts is very, very small, and I think it deserves more attention. But what we really need is just the personal leadership of the president, a president who would honor artists, who would display their work, who would be seen occasionally reading a book or attending a theatrical performance, who would make a statement by his conduct that what we all know. It's an important part of our culture and a tremendous way of enriching the lives of ourselves and our kids.
Des Moines, Iowa, go ahead, please.
Yes, Governor Babbitt, I'd like
Hi.
to know what you propose to do about the notch baby.
Well, the problem with the notch babies is that it's easy to say yes, but the costs are really unbelievable. And I'd just make you this offer. I think we've got to do something for those notch babies who have no other income. I guess what I'm saying is I think we've got to help the people who need it first. And my pledge to you would be that those notch babies who are living on just Social Security would get some relief when I'm president. But I would try to focus it on the basis of need.
Would you make any other changes in the Social Security system?
Sure. I think we ought to tax benefits for upper income recipients. You know, it's not written in Holy Writ that the Mellons and the DuPonts ought to get tax-free benefits. Now, why is that important? Because we must expand Medicare. Medicare is okay until you get really sick. I mean, I learned this with my father over the last 6 or 8 months. Medicare coverage runs out when you become catastrophically ill or when it's time for nursing care. And if we could tax the people who have other income, bring that money into the Social Security Trust Fund, I think we then have the basis for providing much broader Medicare coverage, which would be available for everybody.
Our guest is Bruce Babbitt, a Democratic candidate for president. Next call, Columbia, Maryland. Go ahead, please.
Hello, Governor. How are you?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Okay, listen, one of our chief rivals in our party has advocated increased surveillance and increasing the revenues on the tax side. And one thing he hasn't addressed is the revenues that we're giving out through the various programs. And I have to admit, I am a federal employee. And one of the things that I see at work, for example, is this contracting out by the current administration, which is costing over and above what a federal employee could do. It's costing the taxpayers significant increases in revenues. And I was wondering, do you think there also ought to be the same type of surveillance placed on that type of activity as we would on increasing the revenues through taxes?
Sure. You know, I think there are some things that logically can and ought to be contracted out, and there are other things that there's just nonsensical. During my time as governor, I'd say roughly what I found was this. Social services are tough to contract out. I mean, you know, I think it's crazy to contract out prisons, for example. I mean, that's a state function, and the idea of having low bidders, you know, administering the constitutional rights of inmates or dealing with many types of social services, I don't think it's very workable. If you're building highways or buildings, fine. Now, obviously, a lot of things fall in between, but it seems to me what we have to do is try to make good distinctions between what really works and those things. I mean, I like to think the law enforcement and the courts are, you know, still a function of government. Air traffic control, the administration of parks, a lot of things that, you know, they seem to be saying, oh, well, just, you know, the lowest bidder wins.
Des Moines, Iowa. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, Mr. Babbitt, we read in a paper, Des Moines Register, about several times you attacking the IBP company.
Yeah, you sure did.
Safety procedures and things. Have you ever been in an IBP plant?
Not in Iowa, I haven't. I learned, though, you know, about IBP back in the days when they offered to come to Arizona and said, you know, we'll come to Arizona if you'll provide, you know, a whole lot of incentives and free land. I never went to one of their plants, but I did read the studies. I read the records of all the congressional hearings that have taken place, the stuff that appeared in the Wall Street Journal. I've been briefed on all the OSHA reports, and I got to tell you, it's an outrage. What goes on in those plants is an outrage. And then they're up in Congress, you know, submitting false statements about injury rates. So, you know, I'll stick by my guns on IBP. We're not going to build America by trying to emulate Hong Kong, by cutting wages, tolerating those kinds of injury rates, the high turnover. And I just think it's a business of political leaders to speak out and say, we don't compete that way. We compete by treating employees decently, by encouraging cooperation, profit sharing, employee stock ownership, that kind of thing.
Venice, Florida. Good evening. Go ahead, please.
Hi. Good evening, Governor Babbitt. I want to tell you that I can't wait to vote for you on Super Tuesday.
Thank you. I'll be there.
And I want to ask you sort of a dual question. First of all, is there a certain level of success that you must reach in Iowa and New Hampshire in order to keep going? And secondly, related to that, what is your strategy for the huge Super Tuesday primaries?
Look, those are good questions. You know, I've not been a well-financed candidate. I've certainly met the spending limitations in Iowa and New Hampshire. But in some measure, it's left me a little short of organization in Florida, as you may have noticed. Now, I'm banking on doing well in Iowa. I don't think I have to finish first. I think it's a possibility, but I don't think I have to finish first. We got a good organization. I think I've been, in a sense, the beneficiary of pretty low expectations. I think I'm going to exceed them. That I'll do well in New Hampshire, and you know, look, I'm on the track running the horse race. The press are the people up there kind of tallying the score, setting the expectations. And I'll read the newspaper next Tuesday, and call me next time I'm on the show, and I'll tell you. But I will be there.
Now, you're fairly low in the polls, below Representative Gephardt, Senator Simon, Governor Michael Dukakis, the Reverend Jesse Jackson. Where do you expect to finish up? What would be a victory for Governor Bruce Babbitt on the caucus night?
I honestly don't know. I can tell you that, you know, as recently as the 1st of January, we were at 2% in the Iowa polls. We're in double digits now, at least in 4th place. Now, that's a tremendous move from 2 to 11 or 12 in the last 30 days. If that momentum keeps going through this weekend, who knows? Look, the plain fact is that my sense out there is a lot of undecided people. It's clear that the three amigos, if you will, are Simon, Dukakis, and Gephardt. They're kind of sitting on a three-way tie, kind of, you know, with their arms draped around each other, not saying very much, doing a little bit of attacking, but basically just kind of toughing it out. I'm right behind, coming up fast, and trying to stir it up a little bit, trying to, you know, keep after them to say, let's not just go into hibernation on the eve of the campaign. Let's have a campaign.
Dubuque, Iowa, go ahead, please.
Yes, good evening, Governor Dukakis. Good luck on Monday night. You talk about Paul Simon and Dukakis and Gephardt, but specifically let me ask you something about Paul Simon, since you're apparently not afraid to speak about the other candidates' issues. We're a bit on the fence between you and Paul Simon, and I have to mention Gary Hart also. Can you tell us or give us your opinion of what might be wrong or right about the Paul Simon Jobs Program? It's a question we haven't really been able to figure out where the money is going to come from and how it's going to be handled. And if you have time after you answer that question, can you give us a general idea of what you think is the biggest hole in Gary Hart's candidacy?
Yeah. My skepticism about Senator Simon's jobs program is that, look, we all know that the best way to create jobs is to get the economy going. And my sense is that that means we've got to deal with this deficit issue. Otherwise, we're all going to be out of jobs. And that therefore the first priority is to have a really clear, honest, direct answer to the deficit. And that is, we must cut expenditures, not across the board, as they've all been voting for, but on a principled, selective basis. Use needs testing, look at the military budget, and raise taxes. I mean, we all know it has to be done. And it just seems to me that honesty and respect for you as a voter ought to, you know, compel us all to admit that and to talk honestly about it. The problem with the jobs program is it's an enormous expenditure that'll simply widen the deficit and make matters worse in the short run. Now, you know, back in my earlier career, I worked in the anti-poverty programs, the civil rights movement, and saw, you know, the utility of job creation programs. They are, for people who have no alternatives, who need job training skills, an important and strong and democratic idea. But you got to have priorities. You got to deal with the economic issue first, and then look in a very modest way about priorities for job creation. My priorities would be high school kids, those kids standing on street corners in inner cities. Look, that's a pretty long answer, but it's an interesting question, and I'd summarize it by saying Senator Simon's got to be more persuasive about that deficit. That's step one. And a lot more modest about this idea that we have the resources to create jobs for everybody, because we don't, and we have to target the starts that we make.
Provo, Utah, good evening. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the next President of the United States.
Thank you.
The question I have for you, Governor Babbitt, is we know that the present administration has dealt with policy by pretending it doesn't exist. How do you plan on dealing with poverty and specifically the homeless?
Well, okay. The first step in dealing with poverty, frankly, is just to raise the minimum wage. Get a lot of people out of poverty by doing that. Dealing honestly with the economic issues would make a tremendous, tremendous difference. That's why that deficit is so critically important. That's why I've talked about these concepts of workplace democracy. You know, rather than protectionism, we've got to strengthen the American workplace and get productivity by giving workers a piece of the action, a sense that they have a stake in the success of their efforts. The homeless. It's an unspeakable tragedy what's happening in the streets of our cities. We must restore federal emergency assistance and the federal housing programs which have fallen by the wayside. But you know, you have to ask how you're going to pay for it. And what I would ask you is this: why do we, as Americans, subsidize, give taxpayer subsidies to people who buy ski condominiums up there in Utah and Arizona, at the same time that we're destroying the programs to help the homeless? I'd finance it by revoking the mortgage interest deduction for second homes and saying we're going to use that money for the real priority, which is the homeless.
Des Moines, Iowa. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'm calling from Des Moines, and I think I'm very interested in knowing what your strategy would be if you were elected, the Democratic representative against the Republicans. How would you win? It's that we have a Democrat in office.
Well, look, my strategy, you know, I think is getting easier and easier. We've been watching Dole and Bush the last couple of days. I mean, it's unbelievable. You know, this Democratic nomination is really going to be worthwhile. I mean, those guys, you know, the civil war is broken out in the asylum. And you listen to what they say. I mean, would I like to campaign against George Bush? Yeah, I really would. I mean, you know, that guy, rumored to be the Vice President of the United States, gets up and says, I'm going to deal with the deficit with a tax cut. You know, can you believe that? You know, what does he think is on the minds of the American people? He's now in Iowa running an ad in which he says, well, I'll deal with deficit with expenditures if you'll give me a line item veto. But what's he going to do with the line item veto? I mean, they're insulting your intelligence. Dole is scarcely better. He says, well, we'll have a budget freeze. Well, come on, you can't have a budget freeze for AIDS research, for those pitiful programs for the homeless, for sick kids. Got to start making choices. And I just think if we talk honestly about these issues, we're going to look mighty good in comparison to what they've done over the last 7 years.
What about the label of the Seven Dwarfs? Every editorial cartoonist in the country has drawn that. It's been written about. How has that hurt not only your campaign, but all Democrats?
Carl, I don't think it's a problem. I mean, what it says is that we started off, nobody had any idea who we were. We're new to the process. Most of us are relatively unknown. I think it's a self-liquidating problem. I mean, somebody will emerge. I'm going to emerge, and I won't be a dwarf.
It started, one would guess, because when you compare the experience, you look at Senator Bob Dole, former majority leader, currently the minority leader of the United States Senate, Vice President George Bush, and the different jobs he's had in government, compared against some of the Democrats. Is that a problem, the experience difference between many of the Democrats and some of the Republican candidates?
You know, it's not your resume. It's what you're about. What do you know, George Bush holds up this resume and says, you know, I've been in every corner of the earth, but I didn't know nothing about the Iran-Contra affair. Well, you know, how can he expect you to take that resume seriously when he spent, you know, 7 years apparently oblivious to the foreign policy of the United States, a president who has no idea what's going on, a vice president who disclaims any responsibility, you know, and a crowd of soldiers of fortune roaming around the world. It seems to me the issue is not the resume. It's how do you make decisions? What's your worldview? And, you know, what are you going to do as president?
What is your reaction when you see yourself drawn? I wanted to ask you this. When you see yourself drawn in some of these editorial cartoons as something like one of the Seven Dwarfs, a man running for president of the United States.
Listen, I've been in elective office for a long time, and I can tell you, editorial cartoonists are mean people. And they've been at me for, you know, 10 years now. It's part of the process.
Sacramento, California. Good evening. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'd like to commend Mr. Babbitt on his honesty I've been looking at the field of candidates, and this is the first one of them that's really stood out to me to be somebody who's actually tackling tough issues and willing to answer questions. What I'd like to ask you, Mr. Babbitt, is how you feel about the media coverage of your candidacy. I noticed that from what I've been seeing, a lot of the times I'm watching television, they're more interested in where Gary Hart left in about these tough issues, that you're willing to stand up and say, hey, look at what's going on in America. This is what's really happening. We've got to do something about our economic situation and such. So how do you feel about how the media is presenting your facts and what you'd like to say? And also, what are your plans beyond Iowa and going on through New Hampshire and stuff? If, say, you finish second or third, you're going to be able to continue to put forth this message of yours, this honest message that you're trying to get to the American people?
Well, the easy one first. Yeah, I'm confident that I'm going to finish strong enough and that the money will, the money's the real issue. It's coming in very well now, and that, I'll have staying power, even if I'm not, the front runner coming out of Iowa. Look, I give the press pretty good marks. I think that, my message is, it's a little more complicated. It's a little more challenging in truth-telling. I think it's getting out. I think there's a tendency in the press you're up one time, down the next. Last summer, frankly, they were writing me off, and they kind of rolled me into my grave, covered it up, were planting daisies on it, and for about 30 days, every single article, Bruce Babbitt has no money, can't talk, from a small state, no political base, goodbye. He'll pull out any day now. But I've had a much better run in December and January, and if you average it all out, look, I think it's pretty good. I am not going to join some of the other candidates in saying, that the villain is the American press, particularly when I'm taking Carl's time and money to sit here and have the chance to talk directly to you and, thousands of other people.
Iowa City, Iowa. Good evening. Go ahead, please.
Governor Babbitt, 7 years ago I came from Egypt to reside in Iowa City. I claim that I am one
You must like cold weather.
who do understand the complex Middle East problem. I had the honor to be close enough to President Sadat during the time he took the giant step to visit Jerusalem. Now, how do you foresee the prospects of a Middle East settlement under President Babbitt? By the way, I am an editorial cartoonist too.
I'll answer you anyway. Look, what's going on in the Middle East right now is really posing a grave threat to all of us. And I think that the one message that comes through is that the status quo cannot continue. Now, my feeling is the President has just simply walked away from this problem over the last 4 or 5 years. President Ford made progress, President Nixon made progress, President Carter went to Camp David with Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin and produced a result. And the only reason that result came is because Jimmy Carter was tenacious and wouldn't take no for an answer and said, the United States of America has an obligation to make it happen. Now, the plain fact is that we got to get back to that. We've got to say to the Israelis, who are our friends, to whom we are committed and to whom we must remain committed, we've got to dust off those Camp David Accords. There must be a settlement. It's our job then to go to the Arab countries and say, we're going to find a bargaining partner. We're going to start putting some leverage on the Jordanians, the Egyptians, and maybe out of all of this chaos of recent events, there will be a new generation of leadership in the West Bank that may pose some hope as well. So what I'm saying is the crisis may give rise to some opportunities, but for the last 5 years, we haven't been there to take advantage of them. And the real message is the President of the United States must say to all parties, we're going to dust off those Camp David Accords. We're not going to take no for an answer, and we are going to get down to process and find an accommodation along those lines.
Fall River, Massachusetts. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Governor, you just blew my question. My question was why you and your other former Democrats have seemed to disassociate yourselves with the Carter administration. And do you think history will judge President Carter in a different light than popular right now?
Yeah. Look, this is one guy who believes Jimmy Carter is going to be treated a lot better in history You know, Reagan is still blaming him for all the failures of the last 7 years. Look at Jimmy Carter's record in foreign affairs. Camp David alone would justify that entire presidency. The SALT treaties. I happen to be very close to what goes on in Latin America. I've lived there. I speak the language. The Panama Canal treaties, opposed by Ronald Reagan, opposed by the conservatives, were a great diplomatic achievement. President Carter had a lot of bad luck on domestic economics, to say nothing of the Iranian hostage crisis. I think history will treat him pretty well.
Harlan, Iowa. Good evening. Go ahead, please.
Oh, yes. I would like to know why they are bringing up the issue of the condition of our space program, and what do you think we could do to change that around?
The space program. I think there are some things that urgently need doing. First of all, the space shuttle was too many eggs in one basket. We don't need to have, you know, just manned missions. In the old days, we had the Apollo 5 rocket systems. We had a lot of launch vehicles. We need to get back to a diverse set of objectives, manned and unmanned. I think a space station makes sense. I think we ought to move toward some kind of presence on the moon. I think that's an important scientific and, if you will, political objective that's reasonable. The question then is, how do you pay for it? We've got to stop the deployment of Star Wars. You know, it's taken our best scientists, billions of dollars, and it's all being wasted on a program that's classified, that provides few, if any, benefits for anything else, and is only making the world a more dangerous place. We ought to move that money into an unclassified, diverse space program that is centered in American universities and provides real benefits for all of us.
The INF agreement currently before the Senate. What's your thoughts on that treaty?
Carl, I don't understand. You know, again, there's a civil war in the asylum. The Republican candidates come here opposing an INF treaty sponsored and negotiated by their own president with, you know, trailblazing verification provisions, on-site verification. Whoever thought we'd see the day when, you know, Soviet citizens are living in southern Utah monitoring space plants, when Americans will be living in the Soviet Union. It's a good step. It's not nearly enough, but it's an important step because at last the president, after a career of opposing these things, is now committed to the concept, and it ought to lead us to some agreements against deploying Star Wars, to a comprehensive test ban treaty. Look, what we got to do is start responding to the Russian overtures. How far can we go? We'll never know until we start responding, whether it's force reductions in Europe, limitations on proxy intervention in the third world. You know, we've got to get some energy and some initiative and act like we understand that the world's changing. It's changing, by the way, very much in our favor. We're winning, and we got to start acting like it.
As a governor of Arizona, you had to deal with many problems. One of them was not something like negotiating an arms control treaty. Has that been a difficult assignment, boning up, learning the issues involved in arms control?
Carl, I'll tell you, after 9 years of negotiating with a conservative Republican legislature, after 2 rounds of industry-wide labor negotiations, climaxing in one in which I was the mediator in an industry-wide settlement, you know, the art of negotiation is not something that's unknown to a governor. I mean, you don't sit on the sidelines. Now, the substantive content of arms control, well, you know, you find good people. I've spent a lot of time with Sid Drell at Stanford, Dick Garwin at the IBM laboratories, and others. But, you know, I'm not going to be there in Geneva haggling over throw weights and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. I mean,